Have you ever loved someone so deeply that when they walked away, you felt like your entire world shattered into a million pieces? Have you ever wondered how someone who claimed to love you could turn into a stranger overnight, leaving you questioning everything you thought you knew about yourself? Let me tell you something that might save your life, or at least save you from the kind of pain I endured. This is my story, and I'm sharing it because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear these words. Someone needs to know they're not alone, they're not crazy, and most importantly, they can survive what feels utterly unsurvivable right now. My name doesn't matter, but my story does. 3 years ago, I was lying on my bathroom floor at 3 a.m, sobbing so hard I couldn't breathe, clutching my phone and reading the text message that had just destroyed me. It was from him, the man I thought was my soulmate, the person I had built my entire future around. The message was cold, clinical, detached. It said he needed space, that he wasn't sure about us anymore, that maybe we weren't right for each other. Just like that. No warning, no explanation, no chance to fight for what we had. I remember staring at those words until they blurred together, my tears making it impossible to see the screen. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the phone twice. My heart was racing so fast I thought I might be having a heart attack. I couldn't understand what was happening. Just 2 days earlier, he had told me he loved me. He had made plans for our vacation next month. He had talked about moving in together. How could everything change so quickly? How could someone flip a switch and become someone completely different? I spent that entire night on that cold tile floor, my mind racing through every conversation we'd had, every moment we'd shared, trying to find the exact second where everything went wrong. I analyzed every word I had said, every action I had taken, searching desperately for my mistake. What had I done to push him away? What could I have done differently? The truth is, I didn't sleep for 3 days after that message. I couldn't eat. I couldn't function. I called in sick to work because I literally could not stop crying long enough to get dressed. My friends tried to comfort me, but their words felt empty. They said things like, "You deserve better," and "he wasn't worth it," and "time heals all wounds." But none of it penetrated the fog of devastation that had consumed me. I felt like I was drowning in an ocean of grief, and no one understood that this wasn't just a normal breakup. This felt like death. This felt like someone had reached into my chest and ripped out my heart while it was still beating. But here's what I didn't know then. What I couldn't possibly have understood in that moment of absolute despair. This wasn't just a breakup. This was the final move in a carefully orchestrated game of psychological manipulation that had been playing out for over a year. He didn't end our relationship because he fell out of love with me or because we weren't compatible. He ended it because that was always the plan. He ended it to break me down, to destroy my sense of self, to leave me so shattered that I would spend months, maybe years, trying to piece myself back together while he moved on without a second thought. He ended it because that's what he does. That's what he's always done. And I was just one in a long line of women who had fallen for his act, who had believed his lies, who had given him everything only to be discarded like trash when he was done playing with us. I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking I should have seen the signs. You're thinking there must have been red flags, warning signals, moments where I should have known something was wrong. And you're right. There were signs everywhere. But when you're in love, when someone has convinced you that you found your person, when you're living in what feels like a beautiful dream, you don't see the signs. Or maybe you see them, but you explain them away. You make excuses. You give them the benefit of the doubt. You believe their explanations because you want to believe them. You need to believe them. Because the alternative, the truth, is too terrifying to face. The truth is that you've fallen in love with someone who doesn't actually love you back. Someone who is incapable of real love. Someone who sees you not as a person but as a source of supply, as an object to be used and discarded when they've extracted everything they need from you. Sitting on that bathroom floor, I didn't know any of this yet. All I knew was pain. All I felt was confusion and heartbreak, and a devastating sense of loss that went deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. I felt like I had lost not just my boyfriend, but my future, my identity, my sense of safety in the world. I felt like I had been erased. And that's exactly what he wanted me to feel. That was the whole point. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was intentional. It was designed to inflict maximum damage. And God help me, it worked. It worked so well that I didn't think I would survive it. I genuinely believed that this pain would kill me, that I couldn't possibly continue living with this weight crushing my chest, making it impossible to breathe. But I'm here now, 3 years later, and I'm not just surviving. I'm thriving. I'm stronger than I ever thought possible, and I've helped 5 other women escape from him, from the same manipulative patterns, the same emotional abuse, the same devastating discard that he put me through. This is the story of how I went from that broken woman on the bathroom floor to someone who has found purpose in her pain, who has transformed her suffering into strength, who has taken the worst experience of her life and used it to protect others from the same fate. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the day I met him, because understanding how this started is crucial to understanding how it ended. It was a Saturday afternoon in May, and I was at a coffee shop in downtown, sitting by the window with my laptop, working on a presentation for work. I wasn't looking for love. I wasn't looking for anything except a good cup of coffee and a quiet place to focus. That's when he walked in. I noticed him immediately, and I hate admitting that because it feels like I'm validating his power over me. But the truth is, he was magnetic. He had this confidence about him, this presence that made people turn their heads. He was tall, well-dressed, with dark hair and these intense blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He ordered his coffee, and then, instead of sitting at one of the many empty tables, he approached me. His opening line was smooth but not sleazy. He said something about how he hated to interrupt my work, but he'd been standing in line trying to think of a reason to talk to me, and he couldn't let himself leave without at least introducing himself. He said I had this energy about me that drew him in, that he felt like he needed to know who I was. I remember blushing, laughing, telling him I was just a boring accountant working on spreadsheets. He sat down without asking, but somehow it didn't feel intrusive. It felt natural, like he belonged there across from me. We talked for 3 hours that day. He asked me questions about my life, my dreams, my fears, and he listened, really listened, in a way that most people don't. He remembered details. He followed up on things I mentioned in passing. He made me feel seen, heard, understood in a way I'd never experienced before. He told me about his life too, his difficult childhood, his struggles, his dreams of making something meaningful of himself. He was vulnerable in a way that men rarely are on a first meeting, and that vulnerability made me trust him instantly. He said he'd been through a lot of pain in his relationships, that women had hurt him deeply, that he'd almost given up on finding someone who could understand him. By the time we exchanged numbers, I was already hooked. I remember texting my best friend that night and telling her I'd met someone special, someone different. I used the word soulmate even though I'd never believed in that concept before. Something about him just felt right, felt destined, felt like the universe had finally decided to give me what I'd been waiting for. Our first date was a week later, and it was perfect. He took me to this little Italian restaurant that he said was his favorite, though I would later learn he took all his girlfriends there. He pulled out my chair, ordered wine for us, and spent the entire evening making me feel like I was the most fascinating woman he'd ever met. He asked about my childhood, my relationship with my parents, my past heartbreaks, and when I told him about my ex who had cheated on me, he held my hand across the table and told me he would never do that to me, that I deserved someone who would treat me like a queen, that he wanted to be that person if I'd give him a chance. He kissed me that night outside my apartment, and it felt like fireworks. It felt like every romantic movie I'd ever seen, every love song I'd ever heard, suddenly made sense. Within 2 weeks, we were inseparable. He texted me constantly, good morning messages that made me smile before my eyes were fully open, good night messages that were the last thing I read before falling asleep. He wanted to see me every day. He introduced me to his friends quickly, which I took as a sign that he was serious about me, that he saw a future with me. He told me he loved me after just 3 weeks, and while part of me thought it was fast, another part of me felt like I loved him too, like I'd known him forever, like we'd been waiting our whole lives to find each other. Looking back now with clear eyes, I can see all the warning signs that I missed in those early weeks. The love bombing, as I would later learn it's called. The intensity that felt romantic, but was actually a strategy to bond me to him quickly, to make me dependent on him before I could see who he really was. The way he mirrored everything I said, claiming to love the same movies, the same music, sharing the same values and dreams. It was all a performance, carefully calculated to make me believe we were perfect for each other. I can see now how he rushed the relationship, pushing for commitment and intimacy at a pace that should have felt uncomfortable, but instead felt thrilling. I can see how he positioned himself as the victim in all his past relationships, painting his exes as crazy or cruel, which should have been a red flag, but instead made me want to be the one who finally treated him right. I can see how quickly he started making comments about my appearance, framed as compliments at first, telling me I looked beautiful, but would look even better if I wore my hair a certain way or dressed in a certain style. I can see how he started to isolate me, subtly at first, making comments about how my friends seemed negative or how my family didn't understand me the way he did. But in the moment, Blinded by what I thought was love, I saw none of this. I saw only a man who adored me, who made me feel special, who had chosen me out of all the women he could have had. I felt lucky. I felt grateful. I felt like I'd finally found my person. Have you ever fallen for someone so completely that you lost sight of yourself? Have you ever been so consumed by a relationship that you didn't notice the person you were becoming? That's where I was headed, though I didn't know it yet. The first 3 months with him were a whirlwind of romance and intensity, and I was floating on a cloud, believing I'd found my happily ever after. The shift from romance to control happened so gradually that I didn't notice I was being manipulated until I was already trapped in the web he'd woven around me. It started small, almost imperceptibly, like watching the seasons change. You don't notice the exact moment when summer becomes fall, when the green leaves start to turn yellow, until one day you look around and realize everything has changed. That's how it was with him. One day I was independent and confident, and the next, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened, I had become someone I didn't recognize anymore. It began with comments that seemed caring on the surface but had sharp edges hidden underneath. He started questioning my choices in subtle ways. When I mentioned going out with my girlfriends on a Friday night, he would say things like, "Of course you should go, I just worry about you being in that part of town at night," or, "I trust you completely, but do you really think Sarah is a good influence on you?" He never outright forbade me from seeing my friends, which would have been an obvious red flag, but he made me feel guilty for wanting to spend time away from him. He would get quiet and withdrawn if I chose them over him, and I found myself declining invitations more and more, preferring to avoid his sulking mood rather than have fun with my friends. He started making comments about my clothes, saying things like, "That dress is beautiful on you, but don't you think it's a little revealing? I just don't want other guys looking at what's mine." At first, I found his possessiveness flattering. I thought it meant he cared deeply about me, so I changed my outfit. Then I started changing my outfits more frequently, checking with him before I left the house, seeking his approval for what I wore. Without realizing it, I had handed him control over something as basic as my own appearance. The gaslighting started around month 4. He would say something hurtful, and when I confronted him about it, he would deny ever saying it. He would tell me I was being too sensitive, that I was misremembering, that I was twisting his words. Once, he made a comment about my weight, suggesting I might want to cut back on carbs. When I told him that hurt my feelings, he looked at me with such confusion and concern, saying he never said anything about my weight, that he thought I was perfect, that I must have misunderstood him. He was so convincing that I actually started doubting my own memory. Did I imagine it? Was I being overly sensitive? Was my perception of reality flawed? This happened over and over until I stopped trusting my own mind. He began monitoring my phone, always framed as curiosity or playfulness. He would grab my phone while I was in the shower and scroll through my messages. When I objected, he would say, "What are you hiding? I thought we didn't have secrets." He made me feel like my desire for privacy was a sign of dishonesty, like I was doing something wrong by wanting boundaries. Eventually, I gave him my passcode and stopped caring when he went through my phone, because I had convinced myself this was what people in love did. They shared everything. They had nothing to hide. He isolated me from my support system methodically. He created drama with my best friend by making a comment that he claimed was a joke, but that she found offensive. When she confronted me about his behavior, he positioned it as her trying to break us up, as her being jealous of our happiness. I found myself in the middle of a conflict, and ultimately, I chose him. I distanced myself from her, my closest friend since college, because he had convinced me that she was toxic, that she didn't want to see me happy. He did this with multiple friends, creating wedges, planting seeds of doubt, until my social circle had shrunk to almost nothing. The worst part was that he made me believe this isolation was my choice, that I was simply outgrowing people who didn't understand me anymore, when in reality, he was strategically removing anyone who might have seen through his act and warned me. My family started expressing concern about him around month 6. My mother told me she didn't like the way he spoke to me sometimes, that she noticed I seemed different around him, smaller somehow, quieter. My father said he didn't trust him, that something felt off. This should have been a wake-up call, but instead, it drove a wedge between my family and me. He convinced me that they were being overprotective, that they couldn't stand to see me grow up and be independent, that they wanted to control me. He positioned himself as the only person who truly understood me, who saw me for who I really was. I started spending less time with my family, screening their calls, making excuses for why I couldn't come to Sunday dinners. The guilt I felt about this was overwhelming, but he always reassured me that I was doing the right thing, that I needed to prioritize our relationship, that families could be toxic and mine was trying to sabotage our love. The emotional abuse escalated in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. He would build me up one day, telling me I was beautiful and perfect and everything he'd ever wanted, and then tear me down the next, pointing out my flaws, comparing me to other women, making me feel inadequate and desperate to win back his approval. This cycle of idealization and devaluation kept me constantly off balance, always trying to figure out what version of him I would get on any given day. I walked on eggshells, monitoring my words, my tone, my facial expressions, trying not to trigger his anger or disappointment. I became hypervigilant, anxious, exhausted from the mental gymnastics required to keep him happy. He criticized my job, saying I wasn't ambitious enough, that I was settling for mediocrity. He pushed me to apply for positions I wasn't qualified for, and when I didn't get them, he made comments about how I'd let him down, how he'd thought I was more capable than this. He criticized my cooking, my cleaning, the way I organized my apartment. Nothing I did was ever quite good enough. He would point out other women, telling me they were successful or fit or stylish in ways I wasn't, always with a tone that suggested he was settling by being with me, that I should be grateful he'd chosen me despite my shortcomings. I started working out obsessively, trying to achieve the body type he praised in other women. I changed my hair color because he mentioned once that he preferred blondes. I bought clothes I couldn't afford because he said they made me look more sophisticated. I was molding myself into whatever he wanted me to be, losing pieces of my authentic self with each change, and I didn't even realize I was doing it. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October, 14 months into our relationship. I remember the date because it was my birthday, and I had spent weeks planning a quiet dinner at home for us, cooking his favorite meal, setting up candles and music, hoping for a romantic evening together. He had been distant for about 3 weeks leading up to this night, and I couldn't figure out why. Our conversations had become shorter, less meaningful. He was on his phone constantly when we were together, and when I asked who he was texting, he would snap at me for being paranoid and controlling. I had been feeling anxious, sensing that something was wrong but unable to name it. That morning, he had texted me happy birthday with a simple emoji, nothing more. No card waiting for me, no flowers. When he arrived at my apartment that evening 2 hours late, he didn't apologize for being late. He barely acknowledged the effort I'd put into the dinner. He seemed distracted, checked out, like his body was there but his mind was somewhere else entirely. I tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his day, telling him about mine, but his responses were monosyllabic, dismissive. Halfway through dinner, his phone rang, and he answered it at the table, stepping away to take the call in my bedroom. He was in there for 20 minutes. When he came back, he said he had to leave. He said something had come up at work, an emergency he needed to handle. It was 8:30 on a Tuesday night. I knew there was no work emergency. I could see the lie in his eyes, but I didn't challenge him because by that point, I had learned that questioning him only led to arguments where I ended up apologizing for not trusting him. He left my apartment without kissing me goodbye, without acknowledging that it was my birthday, without a gift or card or any indication that this day mattered at all. I sat alone at my dining table, looking at the meal I'd prepared, the candles burning down, the music still playing, and I felt this crushing sense of worthlessness. I cleaned up the dinner, put everything away, and then I did something I'm not proud of, but that I understand now was a desperate attempt to make sense of what was happening. I went through his social media. I had noticed he'd been posting less, that when I tagged him in photos, he rarely responded anymore. I started scrolling through the comments on his posts, and that's when I saw her. A woman who commented on everything he posted, with inside jokes and references to things they'd done together. I clicked on her profile and felt my stomach drop. Photo after photo of them together. At restaurants. At concerts. At places I recognized because he'd told me he was working late or out with friends on those nights. The most recent photo was from 3 hours ago. They were at a bar downtown, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption said, "Best night with my favorite person." I sat staring at that photo for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking. My mind was racing. Was he cheating on me? Was she an ex? A new girlfriend? How long had this been going on? I called him 17 times. He didn't answer. I texted him asking who she was. No response. I sent him screenshots of the photos. Nothing. I stayed up all night waiting to hear from him, my anxiety spiraling into full panic. By morning, I was convinced I had done something wrong, that I had violated his privacy, that I was the one who owed him an apology. That's how twisted my thinking had become. When he finally responded the next afternoon, his message was cold and calculated. He said I had crossed a line by going through his social media. He said I was acting crazy and obsessive. He said the woman in the photos was just a friend, and if I couldn't trust him, then maybe we didn't have a relationship worth saving. He said he needed space to think about whether he wanted to be with someone so insecure and jealous. He turned my legitimate concern about his behavior into a character flaw on my part. He made me the villain in the story. And because I was so desperate not to lose him, because I had invested so much of myself into this relationship, because he had systematically destroyed my self-esteem over the past year, I apologized. I begged him not to leave me. I promised I would work on my trust issues. I told him I would give him all the space he needed. For 3 days, he ignored me completely. No texts, no calls, nothing. I was a wreck. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except getting him back. I sent him long messages telling him I loved him, that I was sorry, that I would do better. I left voicemails that I'm embarrassed to think about now, my voice cracking with desperation, pleading with him to just talk to me. On the 4th day, he responded with that text message I mentioned at the beginning of this story, the one that said he needed space, that he wasn't sure about us anymore, that maybe we weren't right for each other. That's when I found myself on my bathroom floor, completely shattered, unable to comprehend how we'd gotten to this point. The next 2 weeks were the darkest of my entire life. I stopped going to work. I stopped showering. I lay in bed replaying every conversation we'd ever had, trying to figure out where I went wrong. I looked at photos of us on my phone, remembering the good times, convincing myself that if I could just get him back, everything would be okay. I texted him constantly, even though he rarely responded. When he did respond, his messages were brief and cold. He told me I needed to respect his boundaries. He told me I was being clingy and desperate. Each message from him was like a knife to my heart, but I kept reaching out because the silence was worse than the cruelty. My friends, the few I had left, tried to help me. They told me he wasn't worth it, that I deserved better, but I couldn't hear them. I defended him even as he was destroying me. I made excuses for his behavior. I blamed myself for everything. One night, about 10 days after the breakup, I drove to his apartment. I know how pathetic this sounds. I sat in my car outside his building for hours, watching the lights in his windows, hoping to see him, hoping he would see me and realize he'd made a mistake. Around midnight, I saw him come home, and he wasn't alone. He was with her, the woman from the photos. They were laughing, holding hands, and when they got to his door, he kissed her the way he used to kiss me. I watched this happen from my car, and something inside me broke even further. I finally understood that he had moved on. He wasn't coming back. Whatever we had was over, and it had probably been over long before he actually ended it. That night, back in my apartment, I hit rock bottom. I'm going to be honest with you about something that's hard to talk about. I thought about ending my life. The pain was so overwhelming, so all-consuming, that I couldn't imagine surviving it. I felt like I had nothing left to live for. He had been my whole world, and without him, I didn't know who I was anymore. I had no identity outside of being his girlfriend. I had no friends left. My relationship with my family was strained. My job performance had suffered to the point where I was probably going to be fired. Everything in my life had fallen apart, and I couldn't see a way forward. I'm not sharing this to be dramatic or to get sympathy. I'm sharing it because I know there's someone reading this right now who feels the same way, who thinks they can't survive their heartbreak, who believes that life isn't worth living without the person who destroyed them. I need you to know that those feelings, while valid and real, are lying to you. The fact that I'm here today, telling you this story, is proof that you can survive what feels unsurvivable. The morning after that terrible night outside his apartment, I woke up feeling different. Not better exactly, but different. There was this tiny spark of anger starting to burn through the fog of depression that had consumed me. I was angry at him for treating me this way. I was angry at myself for allowing it. I was angry at the situation, at the injustice of loving someone so completely and being discarded so carelessly. That anger, small as it was, became my lifeline. Instead of texting him that morning, which had been my ritual for weeks, I did something else. I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar, "Why does my ex-boyfriend make me feel crazy?" I know it seems like such a simple thing, but it was the first step towards saving my own life. The search results led me down a rabbit hole of articles and forums and videos about narcissistic abuse, emotional manipulation, gaslighting, love bombing, and trauma bonding. With every article I read, It felt like someone was describing my exact relationship, my exact experience, using words I didn't even know existed for what I'd been through. Terms like narcissistic discard and hoovering and flying monkeys started to make sense of behaviors that had seemed random and confusing before. I spent the entire day reading, and then the entire next day, and the day after that. I learned that what I had experienced wasn't love. It was abuse, psychological abuse, emotional manipulation. I learned that people with narcissistic personality disorder follow predictable patterns. They idealize you in the beginning, making you feel like you found your soulmate. Then they devalue you slowly, chipping away at your self-esteem through criticism and gaslighting. And finally, they discard you when you no longer serve their purpose or when they've found new supply. I learned that the confusion I felt wasn't my fault, that it was intentional, that keeping me off balance and questioning reality was part of the strategy. I learned that the intense bond I felt with him wasn't evidence of true love, but rather the result of trauma bonding, where the cycle of abuse and intermittent reinforcement created an addictive pattern that was incredibly hard to break. I learned that my inability to let go wasn't weakness or desperation, but a normal response to this type of psychological manipulation. Reading these articles gave me something I desperately needed: validation. For months, he had been telling me I was crazy, too sensitive, too jealous, too insecure. He had convinced me that every problem in our relationship was my fault, that if I could just be better, do better, we would be happy. But these articles told me something different. They told me I wasn't crazy. They told me I had been systematically manipulated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. They told me that my instincts had been right all along, that the things I noticed and questioned were real, that I wasn't imagining the inconsistencies and the cruelty. This validation was like oxygen to someone who had been suffocating. I found a forum for survivors of narcissistic abuse and created an anonymous account. I started reading other people's stories, and the similarities were shocking. Different details, different faces, but the same patterns, the same tactics, the same devastating results. I finally worked up the courage to post my own story, typing out everything that had happened in our relationship from beginning to end. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people commented, sharing their own experiences, telling me they understood, offering support and encouragement. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. I didn't feel crazy. I felt seen and understood by people who had walked the same dark path I was walking. One woman in the forum sent me a private message. She told me her story was similar to mine, and then she said something that changed everything. She said, "I want you to know something. After my narcissist discarded me, I found out he had done the same thing to at least 3 other women before me. Same patterns, same lies, same devastating discard. We're not special cases. We're part of a pattern. And the only way to break the pattern is to expose it." She encouraged me to reach out to the woman I'd seen him with, not to cause drama or win him back, but to warn her about what she was getting into. At first, I resisted this idea. I told myself it wasn't my place, that she wouldn't believe me anyway, that it would make me look like a crazy ex-girlfriend. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had a responsibility. If I had known what he was really like before getting involved with him, I could have protected myself from so much pain. Didn't this woman deserve the same chance? It took me 3 weeks to gather the courage, but finally, I sent her a message on social media. I kept it brief and factual. I told her I had dated him for 14 months, that I had recently found out he'd been seeing her while still in a relationship with me, and that I wanted her to know what kind of person she was involved with. I didn't expect her to respond, but she did. She messaged me back within an hour, and her message began with, "Thank you for reaching out. I've been feeling like I'm going crazy for the past few weeks, and I needed to hear this." We met for coffee 3 days later, and that meeting changed both of our lives. When I saw her walk into the coffee shop, my first thought was how normal she looked, how confident and put together she seemed. She was beautiful, successful, articulate, nothing like the insecure or damaged person I had imagined. And that's when it really hit me. This had nothing to do with who we were as people. We could be smart, attractive, successful, kind, everything society tells us should be enough, and still be targeted by someone like him because he didn't choose us based on our flaws. He chose us based on our strengths, on what he could extract from us. We sat down and started comparing notes, and the similarities were eerie. He had used the same lines on both of us, taken us to the same restaurants, told us the same stories about his difficult past, used the same tactics to isolate us from our friends and family. She told me she'd started noticing red flags about 6 weeks into their relationship, that he was already becoming controlling and jealous, that he accused her of flirting with other men when she was just being friendly. She said she'd been feeling increasingly anxious and confused, questioning her own perceptions, and my message had confirmed what she'd been starting to suspect. By the end of our conversation, she had decided to end the relationship with him, but more importantly, she told me something that sent chills down my spine. She said, "I've been doing some research since you messaged me. I found 2 other women who commented on his old social media posts, women who seem to have been in relationships with him before you. I think we should find them and warn them about what he's doing." That conversation was the beginning of what I can only describe as my transformation from victim to advocate. Over the next several months, we did find those other women. It wasn't easy. We spent hours going through his social media history, identifying patterns, finding women who had been in his life and then suddenly disappeared. We found Sarah, who had dated him 3 years before me. We found Michelle, who had been with him right before Sarah. We found 2 others whose relationships with him had overlapped with mine, women I hadn't known about, who he had been seeing simultaneously while telling each of us we were the only one. In total, we identified 5 women, including myself and the woman I'd first reached out to, who had experienced the same pattern of abuse from him. Each story was heartbreakingly similar. The love bombing phase where he made us feel like we were the most special woman in the world. The gradual isolation from our support systems. The gaslighting that made us question our own reality. The criticism and devaluation that destroyed our self-esteem. The sudden cruel discard that left us shattered and confused. We created a private group chat where we could share our experiences and support each other. This group became my lifeline during the hardest parts of my recovery. These women understood what I'd been through in a way no one else could. They didn't judge me for staying too long or going back to him, or making excuses for his behavior because they'd done the same things. They celebrated my small victories, like the first day I didn't cry, or the first time I made it through an entire day without thinking about him. They held space for my grief and anger and confusion, and I did the same for them. Through our conversations, we started to see just how calculated and deliberate his manipulation had been. He had told each of us that his ex-girlfriends were crazy, that they'd become obsessed with him, that they'd accused him of things he never did. Now we understood that those crazy exes were probably just previous victims trying to warn others or seeking validation for their own experiences. He had used our empathy against us, positioning himself as the victim of past relationships so we would feel protective of him, so we would work harder to be different from the women who had hurt him before. We realized he had kept us separate intentionally, managing his image carefully so none of us would discover the others. He had love-bombed new supply while devaluing current supply while hovering old supply all at the same time, running multiple relationships simultaneously because he needed constant validation and attention from multiple sources. One of the women, Michelle, had actually tried to warn me when she saw he was dating me. She had commented on one of my photos with him, saying something like, "Be careful with this one." I had blocked her immediately, believing his story that she was a crazy ex who couldn't let go. Now here we were, sitting across from each other in a coffee shop, and she was telling me she'd tried to save me from what she'd been through. The guilt I felt about not listening to her was overwhelming, but she assured me she understood, that she probably wouldn't have listened either if someone had warned her. That's how the manipulation works. He isolates you so completely, makes you trust him so deeply, that even when warning signs appear, even when people try to tell you the truth, you can't hear it. As I worked through my own healing with my therapist, who specialized in trauma from narcissistic abuse, and as I connected with these other survivors, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. My pain started to feel less meaningless. If I could use what I'd learned to help other women avoid this fate or recognize it sooner or escape it faster, then maybe everything I'd been through could serve some good in the world. I started researching narcissistic abuse more seriously, reading books by experts, watching videos by therapists and psychologists, attending support groups both online and in person. I learned about the neurological effects of this kind of abuse, how it literally changes your brain chemistry, creating addiction-like patterns that make it incredibly difficult to leave. I learned about complex PTSD and how it differs from regular PTSD. I learned about the importance of no-contact and gray rock techniques for dealing with narcissists you can't completely avoid. I learned about the healing process and how it's not linear, how you can have good days and bad days, progress and setbacks, and all of it is normal. About 8 months after my breakup, I did something that terrified me. I started sharing my story publicly. I created an anonymous blog where I wrote about my experiences with narcissistic abuse. I didn't name him specifically, but I detailed the tactics he used, the red flags I missed, the pain I endured, and the healing I was experiencing. I thought maybe a handful of people would read it. Within a week, I had hundreds of comments from women thanking me for putting words to their experiences, asking for advice, sharing their own stories. The blog grew. I started receiving messages from women all over the world who were going through similar situations. Some were still in relationships with narcissists and didn't know how to leave. Some had recently escaped and were struggling with the aftermath. Some, like me, were further along in their healing and wanted to help others. I answered every message personally, spending hours each evening responding to women who needed support, who needed to know they weren't alone. Then something unexpected happened. I received a message from a woman named Jessica. She said she'd been dating someone for 4 months and she'd just discovered my blog and my story. She said the man she was dating fit every single pattern I described, and she was starting to become scared of him. She asked if I would be willing to talk with her on the phone. We talked for 2 hours that night. I shared everything I knew about manipulation tactics and red flags. I validated her concerns and told her to trust her instincts. I helped her create a safety plan for leaving the relationship. 3 days later, she left him and blocked him on everything. She told me that my willingness to share my story had literally saved her from years of abuse, that if she'd stayed with him, she knew she would have ended up exactly where I had been on my bathroom floor, broken and suicidal. That conversation changed something fundamental in me. I realized that my story, painful as it was, had power. It had the power to help people recognize abuse before it destroyed them. It had the power to give survivors hope that healing was possible. It had the power to create connection between people who had felt isolated and alone in their suffering. I expanded the blog into a full website with resources for survivors, articles about different types of narcissistic abuse, lists of red flags and warning signs, information about trauma bonding and why it's so hard to leave, techniques for healing and recovery, and a directory of therapists who specialized in narcissistic abuse. I connected with other advocates and survivors who were doing similar work. We started cross-promoting each other's content, creating a network of support that was reaching thousands of people. Then came the most unexpected development. One of the women from our survivor group, Sarah, suggested we report him to the police. She had documentation of threats he'd made to her during their relationship. Another woman had evidence of financial abuse. I had screenshots of manipulative messages and records of stalking behavior after our breakup. We didn't know if anything would come of it, but we decided to try. We filed reports individually, each of us documenting our experiences with him. The police took our statements seriously because there were multiple victims reporting similar patterns of behavior. They opened an investigation. While that investigation was ongoing, Sarah did something incredibly brave. She filed for a restraining order against him. In her filing, she detailed the emotional abuse, the threats, the stalking behavior. And here's what was remarkable. The rest of us in the survivor group wrote statements supporting her application, describing our own experiences with him, creating a documented pattern of abusive behavior. The restraining order was granted. When word got out about the restraining order, something we didn't expect happened. More women started coming forward. Not just women he'd dated, but women he'd worked with who had experienced harassment. Women he'd briefly dated who had frightening encounters with him. Even some women who had just been in his social circle and had witnessed his treatment of girlfriends. Our group of 5 survivors grew to 8, then 10, then 12. Each new story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing just how extensive and calculated his pattern of manipulation and abuse had been. Some of these women had experiences that were even more severe than mine. One woman, Caroline, told us he had threatened her life when she tried to leave him. Another, Amber, had experienced financial abuse so severe she'd lost her apartment and had to file for bankruptcy. A third woman, Maria, described physical violence in addition to the emotional and psychological abuse the rest of us had experienced. Hearing these stories was simultaneously heartbreaking and validating. Heartbreaking because each woman represented another person whose life had been damaged by him, another person who had suffered in ways no one should have to suffer. But validating because it confirmed that what I'd experienced was real, was serious, was worthy of the pain and difficulty I'd endured. As our survivor community grew, I started thinking about how to help not just other victims of this specific man, but victims of narcissistic abuse everywhere. I had learned so much through my own research and healing, and I wanted to share that knowledge in a more structured way. I started volunteering with a local domestic violence organization, attending training sessions to become a victim advocate. I learned about the legal resources available to survivors, the shelter systems, the counseling services, the financial assistance programs that existed. I learned how to help women create safety plans for leaving abusive relationships, how to recognize when someone was in immediate danger, how to connect people with the resources they needed. The training was intense and sometimes triggering, bringing up memories of my own abuse, but it was also empowering. I was transforming my pain into purpose, using my experience to help others in practical, concrete ways. About a year after my breakup, I received a message that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a young woman named Emily, and she said she was currently dating the man who had abused me. She said she'd found my blog through a Google search when she started feeling concerned about his behavior. She said she'd read my entire story and recognized so many parallels to her own relationship. But here's what was different about Emily. She'd only been dating him for 6 weeks, and she was already seeing the red flags because my story had educated her about what to look for. She was reaching out to me before she became fully trauma-bonded, before the abuse escalated to the point where leaving felt impossible. I talked with Emily several times over the next week. I shared everything I knew about his specific tactics and patterns. I connected her with the other survivors in our group, who all offered their support and perspectives. I helped her understand that leaving now, this early, would spare her years of pain and trauma. Emily left him after 7 weeks of dating, before he had the chance to isolate her from her support system, before he had destroyed her self-esteem, before she had invested so much of herself that walking away felt like dying. When she thanked me for helping her avoid the fate I had experienced, I cried. These were different tears than the ones I'd shed on my bathroom floor 2 years earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of profound meaning. Emily's escape represented something bigger than just one woman avoiding one abusive man. It represented the idea that education and awareness could actually prevent abuse, not just help people recover from it afterward. It represented hope that by sharing our stories, by breaking the silence, by refusing to let shame keep us hidden, we could actually change outcomes for future potential victims. This realization energized me. I expanded my blog to include more educational content specifically designed to help people recognize narcissistic abuse in the early stages. I wrote articles about red flags in the first few weeks of dating, about the difference between healthy intensity and love bombing, about why having a separate identity and maintaining friendships is crucial in any relationship. I created checklists and quizzes that people could use to evaluate their relationships. I shared information about healthy relationship dynamics so people would have a baseline for comparison. The response was overwhelming. My website traffic grew exponentially. I was receiving dozens of messages every day from people all over the world. Some were actively being abused and needed help leaving. Some had recently left and needed support during the healing process. Some were years into their recovery and wanted to share their own stories. And increasingly, I was hearing from people who had used my resources to recognize red flags early and avoid relationships with people who displayed narcissistic traits. I started doing speaking engagements at local women's groups, college campuses, and domestic violence organizations. Standing in front of a room full of people and sharing my story was terrifying the first time I did it. My hands shook. My voice cracked. I cried when I got to the parts about the bathroom floor and the suicidal thoughts. But when I finished, women lined up to talk to me. They thanked me for my courage. They shared their own stories. They told me they'd been carrying shame and silence about their experiences for years, and hearing me speak openly about mine gave them permission to start healing. One woman told me, "I thought I was the only person stupid enough to fall for someone like that." Hearing you describe exactly what I went through, hearing that you're educated and smart and still got trapped in that situation, it makes me realize this isn't about being stupid. It's about being human and being targeted by someone who knows how to manipulate human psychology. That conversation crystallized something for me. So much of the shame survivors carry comes from the misconception that abuse only happens to weak, damaged, or unintelligent people. We blame ourselves for allowing the abuse, for not recognizing it sooner, for staying too long. But narcissistic abuse is specifically designed to trap anyone, regardless of their intelligence, education, or strength. These manipulators are expert psychologists who have spent their entire lives perfecting their craft. They know how to identify and exploit the best qualities in people like empathy, loyalty, and the desire to see the best in others. Recognizing that this could happen to anyone didn't excuse his behavior, but it did release me from the prison of self-blame I'd been living in. As my advocacy work grew, I reconnected with my family and rebuilt those relationships. My mother cried when I finally told her the full story of what I'd been through, apologizing for not pushing harder when she'd tried to warn me about him. I assured her that I probably wouldn't have listened, even if she'd pushed harder, that the manipulation was too strong at that point. My father said he was proud of how I'd transformed my pain into something meaningful, how I was helping others avoid what I'd experienced. My relationship with my best friend, the one I'd pushed away during the relationship, slowly healed. She was hurt that I'd chosen him over her, and rightfully so, but she also understood that I'd been manipulated. We had honest conversations about how the abuse had affected me, how it had changed my behavior and my judgment. She committed to learning about narcissistic abuse so she could better support me and recognize warning signs if she ever saw me getting involved with someone problematic in the future. That friendship is now stronger than ever, because we've been through something difficult and come out the other side together. Around the 2-year mark after my breakup, I started dating again. This was terrifying for multiple reasons. I was afraid of being manipulated again. I was afraid I wouldn't recognize red flags. I was afraid my ability to trust had been permanently damaged. But my therapist encouraged me to approach dating as an opportunity to practice healthy boundaries and trust my instincts. She reminded me that I was no longer the naive person I'd been when I met him. I was educated about manipulation tactics. I had a strong support system. I knew my worth. I had clear boundaries. I could recognize red flags. And most importantly, I knew that I would survive even if I did experience heartbreak again. I took things slowly with dating. I wasn't looking for intensity or passion. I was looking for consistency, kindness, and respect. I was looking for someone who had their own life, their own friends, their own interests. I was looking for someone who encouraged me to maintain my independence rather than trying to isolate me. I was looking for someone whose words matched their actions, who was transparent and honest, who respected my boundaries without making me feel guilty for having them. I met someone eventually who embodied all these qualities. His name is David, and our relationship is nothing like what I had with my abuser. There's no drama, no chaos, no walking on eggshells. David is steady, reliable, and genuinely kind. He respects my work as a survivor advocate. He's learned about narcissistic abuse to better understand my experience. He's patient with my triggers and my bad days. He celebrates my healing and my growth. Our relationship isn't perfect because no relationship is perfect, but it's healthy. We communicate openly. We resolve conflicts respectfully. We maintain our individual identities while building a life together. Being with David has shown me what I was missing in my previous relationship. How love should feel like safety rather than anxiety. How a partner should build you up rather than tear you down. Have you ever thought about how your worst experiences can become your greatest teachers? Have you ever considered that your pain might be the very thing that equips you to help others through their pain? That's what I've discovered through this journey. Today, 3 years after that devastating text message that left me broken on my bathroom floor, my life looks completely different. I run a nonprofit organization dedicated to raising awareness about narcissistic abuse and supporting survivors. The organization grew out of my blog and volunteer work, and we now have a team of advocates, all survivors themselves, who run support groups, provide resources, and educate the public about psychological abuse. We've helped hundreds of women identify abuse in their relationships and find the support they need to leave safely. We've trained therapists and counselors to better recognize and treat trauma from narcissistic abuse. We've worked with law enforcement to help them understand the dynamics of psychological abuse and how to respond to reports from victims. We've partnered with domestic violence organizations to include information about emotional and psychological abuse in their programming, because for too long the focus has been primarily on physical abuse, while the equally damaging psychological abuse has been overlooked or minimized. I've become a certified life coach specializing in helping narcissistic abuse survivors rebuild their lives after leaving their abusers. I work with clients one-on-one, helping them process their trauma, establish healthy boundaries, rebuild their self-esteem, and create lives that reflect their true selves, rather than who their abuser tried to make them into. This work is incredibly fulfilling because I get to witness transformations similar to my own, seeing women who come to me broken and confused gradually become strong, confident, and clear-minded again. The survivor group that started with 5 women has grown into a thriving online community with thousands of members from around the world. We've created a safe space where survivors can share their stories without judgment, ask questions, get support during the hard days, celebrate victories, and connect with others who truly understand what they've been through. The community has become a powerful force, not just for individual healing, but for collective advocacy. We've organized awareness campaigns, lobbied for policy changes related to psychological abuse, and worked to educate the public about the reality and prevalence of narcissistic abuse. As for him, the man who tried to break me, karma eventually caught up with him in ways I never could have orchestrated. The restraining order Sarah obtained became public record, and several of his subsequent relationships ended when new girlfriends discovered his history. His pattern of abuse had been documented by enough women that it became increasingly difficult for him to find new victims who didn't eventually discover warnings about him. The last I heard, he had moved to a different state, presumably to start fresh where his reputation hadn't preceded him. I used to fantasize about revenge, about publicly exposing him, about making him suffer the way he made me and so many other women suffer. But I've learned that the best revenge is living well, finding peace, and using my experience to help others. The energy I might have spent on revenge has been channeled into building something positive, something that actually makes a difference in people's lives. I won't lie and say I'm completely healed or that there aren't still difficult days. I still have triggers, moments when something reminds me of the abuse and I feel that familiar tightness in my chest. I still sometimes have nightmares about him. I still occasionally struggle with trusting my own judgment, worried that I might miss red flags in new relationships or friendships. But these moments are becoming less frequent and less intense as time passes. The difference now is that I have tools to cope with these difficult moments. I have a therapist I trust. I have a community of survivors who understand. I have healthy relationships with friends and family who support me. I have a partner who is patient and compassionate when I'm struggling. And I have a sense of purpose that gets me through the hard days. The knowledge that my pain wasn't meaningless, that I've transformed it into something that helps others. One of the most powerful aspects of my healing journey has been forgiveness, but not the kind of forgiveness people often expect. I haven't forgiven him for what he did to me or to the other women whose lives he damaged. What he did was wrong, was cruel, was unforgivable. I don't believe he deserves my forgiveness, especially since he's never shown remorse or taken accountability for his actions. But I have forgiven myself for staying too long, for missing red flags, for believing his lies, for pushing away people who tried to warn me, for losing myself in that relationship. I've forgiven the version of myself who was so desperate for love that she accepted crumbs and called it a feast. I've forgiven the woman who stayed on that bathroom floor crying over someone who wasn't worth her tears. I've learned to have compassion for her, to recognize that she was doing the best she could with the information and emotional resources she had at the time. The lessons I've learned through this experience are lessons I carry with me every day. I've learned that love should never make you feel small or anxious or like you're walking on eggshells. I've learned that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, honest communication, and maintaining your individual identity. I've learned that anyone who tries to isolate you from your support system is not trying to love you, they're trying to control you. I've learned that your instincts are valuable and should be trusted, that if something feels wrong, it probably is wrong, even if you can't articulate exactly what's bothering you. I've learned that healing isn't linear, that it's okay to have setbacks, that recovery from narcissistic abuse takes time and patience and a lot of hard work. I've learned that sharing your story, despite the vulnerability it requires, can be incredibly powerful both for your own healing and for helping others. I've learned that transformation is possible, that you can take the worst thing that ever happened to you and use it to create something meaningful and good. Looking back at the woman I was 3 years ago, lying on that bathroom floor believing her life was over, I wish I could go back and tell her everything I know now. I would tell her that the man who just discarded her wasn't her soulmate, wasn't the love of her life, wasn't worth her tears. I would tell her that in 3 years she'll be stronger than she ever imagined possible. I would tell her that she'll help other women avoid the same fate, that her pain will be transformed into purpose, that she'll build a life more beautiful and authentic than anything she experienced with him. I would tell her that this ending, devastating as it feels, is actually the beginning of her real life, the life where she gets to be fully herself without molding and changing and shrinking to please someone else. But I can't go back and tell her those things. All I can do is share this story with you, hoping that if you're going through something similar, you'll hear what you need to hear. If you're currently in a relationship that makes you feel confused, anxious, and like you're losing yourself, please know that this isn't what love looks like. Love shouldn't hurt like this. Love shouldn't make you question your reality or doubt your worth. If you've recently left a relationship with someone who manipulated and abused you, please know that what you're feeling right now, the devastation and the grief and the confusion, is normal and valid, but it won't last forever. Healing is possible. You will survive this. You will become stronger. You will eventually reach a place where you look back at this experience and recognize it as a chapter in your story, not the whole story. If you're further along in your healing but still struggling with triggers or trust issues or self-blame, please know that recovery isn't linear, that setbacks don't erase your progress, that you're doing better than you think you are. Keep going. Keep healing. Keep believing in yourself. So here's what I want you to do right now. First, I want you to comment below and tell me, have you ever been in a relationship that made you question your own reality? Have you experienced manipulation or emotional abuse? Or maybe you recognized red flags early and got out before it destroyed you? Share your story in the comments because your experience matters, and your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Your voice has power. Your survival has meaning. Don't let anyone make you believe your experience wasn't valid or significant enough to share. Second, I need you to understand something crucial. This story I just shared with you isn't just entertainment. It's education. It's prevention. It's a warning system. The information you learned here about manipulation tactics, red flags, love bombing, gaslighting, trauma bonding, all of this knowledge could literally save your life or someone else's life. Please take this seriously. Share this video with friends who might need to hear it. Talk about these topics openly instead of hiding them in shame and silence. The more we educate ourselves and others about narcissistic abuse, the harder it becomes for abusers to operate in the darkness, to isolate victims, to manipulate people without consequences. Third, if this story resonated with you, if it touched your heart or opened your eyes or made you feel less alone, please leave a like on this video. That simple action helps the algorithm show this content to more people who need to see it. Every like increases the chance that this story will reach someone who's currently being abused and doesn't realize it, or someone who just left an abusive relationship and needs to know they can survive. Your engagement literally saves lives by spreading awareness. Fourth, I want you to subscribe to I Live to Tell right now. Click that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell because this channel is dedicated to sharing real stories from real survivors, stories that educate, inspire, and empower. We're building a community of survivors and advocates who refuse to let abuse continue in silence. By subscribing, you're joining that community, you're supporting this mission, and you're ensuring you don't miss future stories that might help you or someone you love. Finally, I want to leave you with this truth that took me years to fully understand and accept. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not stupid or weak for falling for manipulation. You are human. You have empathy and trust, and the capacity to love. And those are beautiful qualities that someone exploited. That exploitation says everything about them and nothing about you. Your worth was never determined by whether they loved you or stayed with you or treated you well. Your worth is inherent, unchangeable, and not dependent on anyone else's recognition or validation. You survived something that was designed to break you. You're still here, still breathing, still capable of healing and growing and building a beautiful life. That makes you incredibly strong, whether you feel strong right now or not. Thank you for listening to my story, for giving me your time and attention, for being part of this community of survivors and advocates. Remember that healing is possible, that you're not alone, and that your story matters. Keep fighting. Keep healing. Keep believing in yourself. I believe in you, and I'm proof that you can survive what feels unsurvivable. Until next time, stay strong, trust yourself, and never forget that you deserve real love, the kind that builds you up instead of tearing you down. This is I Lived to Tell, and I'm grateful you're here with us on this journey.